have the Gospels been accurately preserved down through the centuries, Dr. Evans?
I believe the Gospels have been accurately preserved down through the centuries, though I suppose some skeptics could say something to this effect. We don't have the originals of Matthew or of Paul's letters, or of any book of the New Testament. What we have are copies of these books. Most copies are hundreds of years after the originals, and all of them have differences in them. Scribes would change the Gospels to reflect their own view, and so on and so forth.
Let me start by saying that when Craig says that the following view is a view of skeptics, that we don't have the originals, we have only copies, that thousands of copies have thousands and 10,000s of mistakes, when he calls that the view of skeptics, it's true, that is the view of skeptics, and it's the view of non-skeptics. It's the view of every scholar who works in this field, including Craig. Everybody agrees. We don't have the originals, we have thousands of copies, and the thousands of copies have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of differences among them.
We want to give proper introductions tonight, and we're delighted that you're here. Dr. Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he came to UNC in 1988 after 4 years of teaching at Rutgers University. At UNC, he has served as both the Director of the Graduate Studies and the Chair of the Department of Religious Studies. A graduate of Wheaton College, Professor Ehrman received both his Master's of Divinity and PhD from Princeton Theological Seminary. And since then, he has published extensively in the fields of New Testament and early Christianity, having written or edited 23 books, numerous scholarly articles, and dozens of book reviews. Let's give Dr. Ehrman a warm Kansas City welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to know how many of you would consider yourselves to be Bible-believing Christians. Right. Good. Okay. How many of you would think that the Gospels are completely reliable? Right. How many of you are here to see me get creamed? Right. Thank you. Thank you for your honesty. Well, I have a tall order with this crowd. I started out in my studies to be a scholar of the Bible. I thought that the question of the reliability of the Gospels was one of the most important questions facing Christians. I, too, thought at that time that the Gospels were, in fact, completely reliable. But when I learned Greek, started reading these Gospels in the original language, started comparing them carefully with one another, grappled with the problems, prayed about the problems, did my level best to deal with the problems, I came to a different conclusion. And all I ask tonight is that you approach this debate with an open mind. Our ultimate question comes down to whether the Gospels are reliable or not. My view is that the Gospels have mistakes, discrepancies, contradictions, factual errors, textual alterations, additions, omissions, and corruptions in them. This is not a unique view of a particularly liberal professor who teaches at Chapel Hill. I know that I seem very liberal. When we were talking about the format for this debate, I asked that I be given the podium on the left.
Have the Gospels been accurately preserved down through the centuries?
My first interest in this particular question about the accurate preservation of the Gospels started out when I was a student at Moody Bible Institute. At Moody Bible Institute, I believed, as did my professors, that the Bible is without error in the autographs. In other words, the originals of the New Testament did not have mistakes in them, even if subsequent copies of the New Testament may have mistakes in them. The problem is, we don't have the originals of the New Testament. What we have are thousands of copies of the New Testament that were made, in most cases, centuries later. We don't have the originals. We have copies made centuries later. These copies that were made centuries later contain numerous mistakes, hundreds of thousands of mistakes. This has been the core of my research for the past 30 years. At some point, I came to the realization that my belief in the inerrancy of the autographs didn't make sense. If God inspired the Bible without error, why hadn't He preserved the Bible without error. I couldn't think of a good answer then, and I still can't think of a good answer now, even though I think I've heard every answer ever proposed. I couldn't any longer believe that God had inspired the originals because I was sure he had not preserved the original. The earlier you go to look at the manuscripts, the more differences you find. The earliest copies have the most mistakes. How many mistakes were made in the copy of the copy of the copy, which served as the copy of all the copies that we now have? We have no way of knowing.
Dr. Ehrman, are the Gospels reliable?
In my view, there is certainly historically reliable information in the Gospels, of course. But there are also pieces of historically unreliable information. This can be seen by the fact that sometimes there are flat-out discrepancies between the Gospels, as you will see yourself if you just read them carefully side by side. Let me give you just a taste out of 1,000 examples. The Gospel of Matthew says that the father of Joseph, Jesus' father, was Jacob. His grandfather was Mathan, and his great-grandfather was Eleazar. The Gospel of Luke says that Joseph's father was Heli. His grandfather was Mathat, and his great-grandfather was Levi. Well, which was it? The genealogies differ. In my opinion now, the accounts of the Gospels cannot be reliable because they differ in hundreds of ways, both big and small, and they contain numerous historical errors.
To my left, Dr. Craig Evans, New Testament scholar, is the distinguished professor at the New Testament at Acadia Divinity College, Acadia University in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, Canada. He's a graduate of Claremont McKenna College. He received his Master's of Divinity from Western Baptist Seminary in Portland, his MA and PhD in Biblical Studies from Claremont Graduate University in Southern California. He's a well-known evangelical scholar that has spoken and appeared throughout the world. He's been elected member of the prestigious SNTS, a society dedicated to New Testament studies. Author and editor of over 60 books, hundreds of articles and reviews, Professor Evans has given lectures at Cambridge, Oxford, Durham, Yale, other universities. Let's welcome Dr. Evans to Kansas City.
Dr. Craig A. Evans, are the Gospels reliable?
Yes, I believe they are. But what the Gospels are, and therefore in what sense they are reliable, is not always understood, either by Christians or by non-Christians. This is one of the reasons why scholars are so keen to find additional data, either through archaeology or through new manuscript discoveries. This is why writings outside the New Testament are taken so seriously. Writings that date from the 2nd and 3rd century are carefully studied on the chance they might contain early reliable material that will tell us more about Jesus and his disciples. The vital question is this: do the Gospels provide us with what we need to know? What the Gospels tell us about Jesus, combined with what his earliest followers proclaimed in the aftermath of Easter, is indeed sufficient for Christian faith. Christian faith. Do the Gospels cohere with these simple summaries of the story of Jesus? Indeed they do. Were the Gospels written early enough to contain authentic and reliable material? Indeed they were. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, were composed sometime in the 60s through to the early 80s, maybe even earlier, when many eyewitnesses were still living. Moreover, the sources utilized by the Synoptic evangelists were much older than the Gospels themselves. I will say more about what it means to describe the Gospels as reliable in my responses to the questions yet to be asked.
Dr. Ehrman, do the Gospels accurately preserve the teaching of Jesus Christ?
I was a bit interested to hear Craig's response to the last question, and my question about that one and this one is still going to be, does he find discrepancies in the Gospels or not? Are there discrepancies? In the New Testament, there are actually things that Jesus said, of course, but there are other things in the Gospels that he did not say. I've always assumed that Craig feels the same way about this. since one of his best-known scholarly books is called Authenticating the Sayings of Jesus. It's a book that presupposes that we have to use scholarly, historical criteria to establish what Jesus really said. The purpose of Craig's book is, quote, to clarify the procedures necessary to distinguish tradition that stems from Jesus from tradition and interpretation that stem from later tradents and evangelists, end quote. Now, some of that is highfalutin scholarly language, but there's no ambiguity about what it means. Some of the sayings of Jesus in the New Testament go back to Jesus himself, and some were made up by those who told stories about Jesus, and some were made up by the gospel writers themselves. The voice we're hearing, the author has modified the voices of John the Baptist and Jesus, because in the Gospel of John, we're not hearing, not Jesus' voice we're hearing. Does he find discrepancies in the Gospels or not? Why does this matter? Because people in our world continue to ask, is Jesus who he said he was? If you read the Gospel of John, you don't learn who Jesus said he was. You learn who John said he was.
Do the Gospels accurately preserve the teaching of Jesus?
I believe they do. Scholars disagree on many things, but most are in essential agreement as to what Jesus proclaimed, and that this proclamation is found in the New Testament Gospels. We can know pretty well what Jesus was out to accomplish. We can know a lot about what he said, and those two things make sense within the world of first century Judaism. Page 2.
Were made up by the gospel writers themselves. Is the Bible then inaccurate in some of the things that it says Jesus said? If so, if it's inaccurate in some things, how do we know that it's not inaccurate in lots of things? And if it's inaccurate in lots of things, what makes us think we can trust it? As a historian, I'm absolutely certain that the Gospels contain sayings that Jesus did not say. I simply list the discrepancy. John. Jesus calls himself God in the Gospel of John, the latest of our Gospels, but what is striking is that he never calls himself God in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, our earliest Gospels. I don't think Jesus really said these things. And so far as I know, either does any other critical biblical scholar. I know of hundreds of biblical scholars, but I don't personally know any scholar of the Gospel of John, except for extremely conservative evangelicals or fundamentalists, who think that John accurately records all of the words of Jesus.
We can know pretty well, know a lot about what he said.
If Craig thinks he does, if he thinks that Jesus did go around Galilee and Jerusalem calling himself God, I'd like him to explain to me on historical, not theological grounds, but historical grounds, how Jesus managed to escape getting stoned to death for blasphemy. And more important, how it is that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't record him calling himself God. That seems like a rather important point. Did they just forget to mention that part?
Jesus was called rabbi or teacher, and his principal followers were called disciples, which in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek means learners. Should we not assume that learners did in fact learn what the rabbi taught? This is not to say that the words of Jesus could not be edited, adapted, applied, reapplied, and even recontextualized.
I want you to pay careful attention to how Craig is phrasing his answers, because he's a very smart scholar. He says that the Gospels are in essential agreement with one another, and we can pretty well know what Jesus says. He says that the Gospel writers adapted the words of Jesus. That means they changed the words of Jesus. If they changed the words of Jesus, then how do we know where they've changed them, and where do we know we're actually reading the words of Jesus? The same thing applies to Jesus' deeds. Can we trust what the Gospels say about what Jesus did? If the stories about Jesus were sometimes changed as Christians told and retold the stories as they adapted them, how do we know that they weren't changed a lot before the Gospels were written down? There are many discrepancies in the accounts, as you can see for yourself, simply by reading them and comparing the gospel stories for one another. What everybody does, of course, is they take Mark's account and they take Luke's account and they smash them together into one big account. So Jesus says everything that he says in Mark, everything he says in Luke, then you throw in what he says in Matthew and what he says in John, and you end up with the 7 last words of the dying Jesus, which you find in none of the Gospels. You are free to do that, to smash them all together, so that Mark's portrayal isn't right, Luke's isn't right. What's right is the one that you've combined. But realize what you've done is you've written your own gospel, rather than trusting any of the Gospels of the New Testament. The problem is the Gospels of the New Testament do not agree either on the sayings of Jesus or on the deeds of Jesus.
Dr. Evans, do the Gospels accurately describe the activities of Jesus?
I do believe that. In his book, Sanders has identified 8 facts or activities of Jesus about which we may be relatively confident. To be sure, results vary and scholars often disagree, but most do agree with E.P. Sanders that an essential and sufficient core of major events and activities are present in the Gospels so that we can know the principal contours of his public life. Relatively confident. Results vary. Scholars disagree.
Are there discrepancies?
Do the Gospels contain eyewitness tradition?
The New Testament Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses or by people who knew eyewitnesses.
Do the Gospels contain eyewitness tradition?
Yes, they do.
What happens to oral stories when they are transmitted orally? They change. The gospel writers have discrepancies among themselves because the stories that were told and retold were changed over time, and the gospel writers themselves sometimes change the stories. That's why there are discrepancies. That's why scholars might be able to tell you generally what Jesus was about. They can list 8 things that Jesus did, but they can't tell you the details and agree. Why can't scholars agree? Because there are so many discrepancies that the Gospels are not reliable.
Near the end of the 1st century, a young Christian named Papias became acquainted with Christians who had been personally acquainted with eyewitnesses. Although most of this work, written in his old age, is now lost, several important quotations have been preserved. Although many questions remain, a fair reading of Papias suggests that there was a living tradition of eyewitnesses that, and it is debatable, that may in one way or another be linked to at least 2 of the Gospels. The Gospels contain accurate, authentic eyewitness tradition that suggests that may in one way or another be linked to, and it is debatable.
The stories are changed and rechanged over the years so that historians have to use these Gospels very carefully and critically because they don't contain eyewitness reports, and we can't assume that what they say is historically accurate. These views are taught at virtually every institution of higher learning in the entire world that is not fundamentalist or evangelical Christian.